After I handed all the evidence to Alexander Corvinus, he watched all the videotapes and recordings of all the bad things Marcus and William did over the years, and then I said, this is the reason why Victor exiled them, sir. He can't help them anymore. Your sons are troublesome for our kind. And then Alexander Corvinus said, yes, that they are. And then Alexander Corvinus asked me, so Victor and his people will no longer take them in, and I suppose you are also aware that Victor himself is not perfect. And then I said, sir, with all due respect, Victor only sometimes feeds on a family of humans, but your sons have slaughtered thousands of innocent people, probably even more than that, I suspect. And then Alexander Corvinus closed his eyes and sighed, and he said, yes, I know that my sons are very troublesome and they have killed even more innocent people than you know, but I am still their father and they will not be completely restricted from everything that our kind has to offer. And then I said, sir, you can't be serious. And then Alexander Corvinus said, but I am serious, and since Victor won't take my sons in, I will. And then I got visibly angry and my eyes turned black for a while, and I said, sir, Marcus was probably planning on destroying the coven just to get his brother back. What if he kills you, sir, just to get everything he wants? And then Alexander said, hold your tongue, boy. And I said, but sir, your sons will cause trouble again, you don't understand. And then Alexander Corvinus said, silence, not one more word. And then Alexander Corvinus said, I have been cleaning up the mess of my two sons for years, and that is my burden, and you think I don't know, boy, and you're not telling me anything I don't already know. I have people everywhere, and I even know you are the strongest of my human bloodline, and you are more of a threat than my two sons could ever be. And then I said, I don't kill innocent people. And then Alexander Corvinus said, yes, I know, and that's why I am allowing you to drink my blood. And then he said, come forward. And then Alexander Corvinus slit his wrist and he allowed me to drink his blood, and I saw all his memories and all the secrets that Celine found out about in the movie Underworld Evolution. And then the pupils of my eyes turned blue and black, and my blue pupils glowed bright blue, and I asked Alexander Corvinus, what will I become? And then he said, the future. And then I heard a loud knock on the door, and one of the guards said, sir, it's your two sons William and Marcus. And then Alexander Corvinus said, let them in. And then one of the guards said, sir, your son William is no longer a lichen. And then Alexander said, I know. And then they opened the door, and then immediately Marcus saw me and said, father, whatever he told you, it is a lie. And then Alexander Corvinus said, it is not a lie, and I know better. And then Marcus told Alexander how Victor and the other elders beat him and exiled him and William. And then Alexander asked Marcus, are you done? Because I am feeling very tired and irritated of all this lying, Marcus. And then Marcus said, father, I'm telling you the truth, Victor is stronger. And then Alexander said, I know all about that, you foolish boy, and I even know how he got stronger than you and William, because Victor fed on him, one of my human descendants, and he was already a very powerful hybrid when he fed on his blood. And did you know they can even eat human food to stop the thirst? And then Marcus asked him, what? But that's impossible. And then Alexander Corvinus said, apparently not. And then Marcus asked Alexander, does that mean they are human? And then Alexander said, no. And then Marcus said, me and William need shelter, please let us stay here, father. And then Alexander Corvinus said, you can both stay here, but you are to cause no trouble while you are both here. And then Marcus said, thank you, father. And then Alexander said, now go wash yourselves in the shower room, you both stink. And then Marcus said, thank you, father. And then Marcus looked at me with hatred while my eyes were turned black, and I growled and snarled at Marcus. And then Alexander said, enough. And then he said, you may leave, James. And then he said, guards, escort him out. And then I walked up to the door and they opened it, and then they all walked me out of the ship, and I said, this is unnecessary. And meanwhile, back on Alexander's ship, Marcus said, you should kill Victor and his people, father, because they bit the hand that feeds them. And then Alexander Corvinus said, I most certainly will not kill Victor, and you're lucky he spared your lives and showed you mercy, and that is not a weakness, boy, that is a strength that someone like you doesn't yet know. And then Marcus said, he humiliated me and William in front of everyone. And then Alexander said, good, you could use a little humility, and you will stay here and you will do nothing, and I will wait and see what Victor does. If he attacks my ship and my people, then I will consider that an act of war, and I will retaliate against Victor.